guys, welcome back. Let me adjust my mic here. Sorry about that. All right, so there's a topic here. It's called NoRedZone, and you'll notice that if you go to my source code at this time, you might see this. And what I did is I removed the NoRedZone from all of my bat files. Now, the reason for this is, well, it's not as complicated as it sounds. The easiest way to say it, we're not on Linux. If you're on Linux, then you're going to need, this is necessary. But here's the thing. We're on Windows, and we're not compiling with the ELF format. We're not using anything that's Linux related. So when we make the UEFI, or the EFI in this case, all right, when we actually compile that on Windows with a Windows-based compiler like the GCC version that I use, and in fact, just so you can see this, let's see, where are you? As you notice, it says here, for Windows, no cross-compiler needed, and that is because this guy, when he compiled it with Windows in mind. How do I know this? Well, scroll down to the bottom, and it says, this is my personal website. I work for Microsoft, but I don't speak for them. So he's already compiled this to work directly, natively, with the x64 version of Windows. All right, so this also means that it utilizes and is ABI compliant, Microsoft ABI compliant. Now, what is Microsoft ABI compliant? Well, Linux is not ABI compliant. And in fact, this link here even talks about this and goes into more detail. Because remember that the EFI uses the Microsoft ABI. We know this also when it compiles down, that it compiles it down to what's called a PE32 Plus. Basically, it's a Windows header file, but it's 64-bit. And you can even look this up. So you could just type in PE32 Plus, and you can actually look it up on the Microsoft website right here, and it goes into detail about the PE32 Plus. You can actually find out more about its header and what it does. Now that's COFF. Here's the file types. Here's the 8664. This is AMD compliant, but it's also works on Intel as well. And as you scroll down, you can find out more about this. And you will notice that this little character right there is in our PE file when you go to actually tear it apart, our EFI file, I mean. So it's 64-bit, and it's Microsoft compliant. It's their header format. So when we go to compile the EFI in Windows, we should not need an ELF format, ELF. ELF is a format for Linux. So there's no reason to mix Linux when you're on Windows. There's no reason for it. That means that when you compile it without the ELF format, that means you're compiling it with the Microsoft ABI, and that makes it compliant with Microsoft ABI. Now here's the kicker. If you use the GNU EFI, which is what some tutorials out there are using, and they're using the sysv ABI interface, then they need the NoRedZone tag for their GCC compiler. That's important for those who use this. And this is a command for Linux users. If you use WSL in Windows, WSL is gives you a kind of an Linux interface, and you compile inside that environment, then you're most likely using the sysv environment because it's Linux. It's kind of backwards. You shouldn't even need to worry about that, but some people out there do that. Point is, it's not Microsoft compliant when you do this, and Linux is not Microsoft compliant. And that seems kind of like, well, that's the way we want it. Well, there's a caveat here. All of the UEFI uses that Microsoft compliant interface for their EFI. That's important to know. So this is why alignment issues become an issue when it comes to talking directly from one file to another, and developers run into problems, and it becomes a big thing. So if you're on Windows, don't use a WSL. Just stick strictly with the regular GCC, the one that's not a cross compiler, and use the regular command interface that, I have set up here for you, and you won't have any issues. Now, I put that in there wrong. Let's look at that. There we go. So let's say this one. Open up the bat file, and if you'll notice, it's not here. But we are Microsoft compliant with the EFI, since the EFI kind of requires it when you go to compile. So now, what is this NoRedZone? Well, it's 128 bytes extra at the bottom of the stack. Now, Linux ignores the standards, hence why a lot of issues, seem to happen. And in fact, other than Linux, I haven't yet to find anybody else make a non-Linux operating system. Think about that for a second, because there's so many problems. That's my opinion, of course, but that's what I have observed over the past 2 decades. So if you're going to make an operating system, make it compliant with the fact that you're using an EFI to boot with, and you're not using legacy booting, which means that all hardware out there that is EFI bootable is Microsoft compliant. This is a key point here that needs to be known. So if you're on Linux, well, then you're basically non-compliant. You're using a Linux interface to make your operating system. And that's where the ELF format comes in. Guess what? That means you're still tied to using Linux. No matter if you think you're going to make a fresh operating system from scratch or not, you're still tied to using the ELF format that is Linux-based. So if you want one that is not Linux-based, not Windows-based, then you use the Microsoft compliant interface for your EFI, and then you compile and create your own header file for your kernel interface. And that is key to being able to develop your own format. Now, you're going to look through and by the way, this article is very detailed, and it actually talks a lot about this. But when you go to look on the OSDev Wiki, check this out, OSDev.org. And if you look at the NoRedZone, read this article. And then you click here, and you can actually go in here. And this goes into much more detail, but there's something about this that needs to be known, is the fact that this is still using the ELF format. Look at what they're using here. ELF. Everything in here is ELF based. That means that all of their Wikipedias and everything that they have is all Linux based, using that ELF format. And this is why so many people are confused about when it comes to the UEFI or EFI, because they don't realize that it's not meant to be using the ELF format. So they run into problems later and give up because things start to not work. And I have yet to find somebody who actually has a complete working ELF-based, in this case Linux ELF-based header format that has actually finished their operating system. I haven't yet to meet anybody that's actually done this yet using the UEFI or the EFI. So this is why this is important. And yeah, if you're not targeting, you don't need to worry about it, blah, 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 and that's fine. But the NoRedZone is a feature described in the x64 ABI, or in this case, Windows, if you're going to use it in Windows. So GCC in general defaults to this if it's a compiler version or GCC version that's on Linux. And if it's a cross-compiler, most likely it's a GCC version that's Linux-based, so that it uses the ELF format. That would be the only reason to have that in Windows, is if you want to work on Linux-based stuff. Now, if you're using regular, and I'm going to repeat this again, if you're using the regular GCC compiled for Windows, you don't need to worry about this. It actually requires the NoRedZone so that it can be EFI compliant and Microsoft compliant. And that's where when you go to read the actual, go back here, and you go to read the actual PDF that's from the official UEFI specs, everything in there is Microsoft compliant. And there's no talk of an ELF or Linux compliancy. And that's because, again, Linux/ELF, all that stuff, it ignores the standards. And there's a reason for those standards, is so that things align up and so that you don't have the problems that everybody else has. And when I say everybody else, I'm talking about the, OSDev.org, because this was their workaround to get around it. For those who were not on Windows, they were on Linux. Well, unfortunately, they didn't give the proper information for those who are on Windows. In fact, you probably won't even find anything about Windows users actually making an operating system. That's where my tutorials come in, because I'm showing you the correct way to do this if you're on Windows. If you're on Linux, well, then guess what? You have no choice. You have to use this. Okay, so you kind of have no choice on that. And in fact, your GCC version most likely defaults to using this flag anyways. So you're going to end up having problems if you use any of my command line switches. So you will have to alter your GCC command line switches. And that also means you'll have to use the ELF file format. But on regular Windows, if you're on Windows, which is what this whole tutorial series is based off of, then that means that you don't have to worry about the NoRedZone. You leave it in place. So that way it stays compliant with the industry standards. So anyways, I wanted to bring this to your attention, bring it up, and I'm working on another tutorial to add to this list, but we'll get to that in a future video. So, all right, thanks for watching. Cheers.